Settle yourself now. Let your body find its weight in this moment. Feel the ground beneath you, solid, supporting, patient. And as you breathe in slowly and out, imagine you are standing at the edge of an ancient river. Not the rivers you know today, but the Nile as it moved through time itself, thousands of years ago. The air around you is warm, not hot, warm like the breath of the earth after sunset. You smell something rich and alive, dark soil, water, the faint green smell of reeds bending in a breeze that has lasted for millennia. This is the air your ancestors breathed, not your blood ancestors necessarily, but your ancestors in the human story. Your ancestors in the story of civilization. We are about to take a journey together, a long, slow journey backward in time, to a place where the sun rose over a river that brought life to a desert. Where people built things so magnificent that we still look upon them with wonder today. Where kings believed they would live forever. Where ordinary people left fingerprints in mud bricks that we can still touch, in a way, through time itself. There is no rush. There is only the current of history, moving gently like that ancient river, and you are floating upon it now, drifting backward, deeper into time. The lights grow softer. The world grows quieter. The weight of sand and stone and centuries settles around you like a blanket of warmth. Let your eyelids grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. This is the world of ancient Egypt. This is where we are going. And so we begin. The story of Egypt does not begin with the pyramids. It begins with water. Long before the first stone was cut, before the first king ruled, before the very idea of Egypt existed as a named thing, there was the Nile. The Nile was already ancient when the pyramids were young. The Nile had been flowing from the highlands of the south, through the desert toward the Mediterranean, for longer than any human mind can truly grasp. It had been doing this when the ice ages still gripped other parts of the world. It had been flowing steadily, rhythmically, as if keeping time for a civilization that did not yet know it would be born. Around 12,000 years ago, 12,000 years before you sit and listen to these words right now. The climate of the world was changing. The ice was retreating. The deserts were becoming drier, and the green places were becoming more precious. In the Nile Valley, something extraordinary was happening. The river itself was transforming from a rushing, chaotic flood into something more regular, more predictable. The ancient peoples who lived along its banks, hunters and gatherers who had followed animals and plants across the savannah, began to notice something remarkable. Every year, the river would rise. Every year, without fail, the waters would come. And when the waters came, they brought with them something precious, rich, dark silt, nutrient-filled soil, carried down from the highlands, from the rainforests of Ethiopia, deposited like a gift upon the banks. The floodwaters would recede, and what remained was black earth, so fertile, so full of life. The ancient Egyptians would eventually call themselves Kemet, the Black Land. This was why. Not the sandy deserts surrounding them, but the black, life-giving soil that the Nile created for them, year after year, like clockwork. Imagine you are a person living in this time, perhaps 8,000 years before Christ, before Jesus, before even the pharaohs. You have always followed the herds. Your family has always been nomadic. But something is calling you to stay by this river. The plants here are growing thick. The animals are concentrating near the water. And you have noticed, you have watched, that season after season, the river provides. What would you do? You would plant seeds in that black soil. You would stop being a wanderer and become a settler. And from that decision, made thousands of times by thousands of families, civilization began to take root. Not all at once, not with great ceremony, but with the quiet determination of people learning to read their environment, learning to plant grain, learning to store food, learning to survive together in one place, by around 5,500 years before our modern era. Before the common counting of years, the Nile Valley had transformed. There were villages, growing villages, villages that were becoming towns, settlements arranged in clusters, some in the north near the Mediterranean, where the river spread into a wide marshy delta, and some in the south, where the Nile ran narrower but fierce, where cataracts, waterfalls, and rapids made travel treacherous. These northern settlements would eventually be called Lower Egypt, Confusing, perhaps, because north is usually up in our minds. But think of it from the perspective of the river flowing northward, downward to the sea. Lower Egypt was where the river ended its journey. Upper Egypt was in the south, where the river began its descent toward the Mediterranean. And these two regions would become the greatest civilization the ancient world had yet known. Around 5,000 years ago, give or take a century. For time was not precisely measured in those days. Something momentous happened. A ruler from the south, from Upper Egypt, began to consolidate power. His name was Narmer, or Menes. History is uncertain, and the records are few and fragmentary. But what we know is this: he was a warrior, a unifier, a man who understood that the Nile Valley was stronger if it was not divided. The story of his unification was recorded on a ceremonial pallet, a flat, ceremonial object carved from stone. Upon it, images show King Narmer striking a defeated enemy. Images show him wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt united. This pallet is one of the oldest written records of history itself, written not in words but in pictures and symbols that told a story of political unification. For the first time, the Black Land had a single ruler. For the first time, Egypt existed as one kingdom. And with that unification, something shifted in the human story. The villages became cities. The cities became centers of power. The river's bounty, the regular, predictable flood that had always provided, began to be organized, controlled, distributed. And the people who organized and controlled it gained power. They became nobility. They became priests. They became kings. This moment, around 3,100 years before Christ, marks the beginning of what historians call the early dynastic period. The dynasties, the family lines of kings, were beginning. And the great age of Egypt was dawning. The Nile had been flowing for eons, but only now did it have witnesses who understood its power. Only now did it have builders and dreamers and visionaries who would look upon this river and say, "We will build something eternal." The Third Dynasty began around 2,668 years before the Common Era. A king sat upon the throne whose birth name was Netjereket, but history would come to know him by another name, one given to him by later writers, by scribes and historians who looked back upon his reign and recognized its significance. They called him Djoser, and Djoser wanted to build something that the desert had never seen. Something that stone and human determination and absolute royal power could create together. He wanted to build a tomb, but not just any tomb, not a hidden chamber beneath the earth. He wanted to build a mountain of stone that would rise up against the sky, that would stand forever, that would house his body and carry his name into eternity. He wanted to cheat death itself. To accomplish this, Djoser called upon a man of extraordinary vision, a man whose name has somehow survived 5,000 years, which is remarkable because most of the laborers and architects of this era are completely forgotten. But this man's name was recorded. His name was Imhotep. Imhotep was not a king. He was not even of noble birth. He was an architect, a designer, a man who could envision structures and then find ways to build them. He was also a physician, a priest, a writer, a man of such evident genius that the Egyptians eventually deified him. They made him a god. Even in their own lifetime, they recognized something extraordinary in him. And what Imhotep envisioned at Saqqara, on the plateau above the ancient city of Memphis, was revolutionary. He designed a tomb that would not be dug underground. Instead, it would be built upward. The structure would be square at its base, made of stone. And it would rise in 6 stages, 6 massive terraces, each one smaller than the one beneath it, like a staircase to heaven. This is what historians would later call the Step Pyramid. When completed, it stood approximately 205 feet tall, taller than any structure the Egyptians had ever built. For a time, for several hundred years, it was the tallest structure in the world. Can you imagine being a worker, a laborer, standing before this site around 2,600 years before our era? Standing on the plateau near Memphis, the city that would become the capital of Egypt, and looking up at what your hands were helping to create. You might not be able to read. You might not understand the theological reasons why your king needed this monument, but you would understand that you were part of something immense, something impossible. The stones themselves were not small. Each block of limestone weighed anywhere from 2 tons to as many as 20 tons. These were not blocks that a man could move alone. These were not even blocks that 10 men could move alone. These were stones that required organization, coordination, engineering, and yet the ancient Egyptians moved them using tools made of copper and wood, tools that seem impossibly primitive to our modern eyes. How did they do it? Historians have spent centuries debating this question. The answer, we now believe, is surprisingly straightforward, even if the execution was extraordinarily difficult. The stones were quarried using copper tools, and then, and this is important, they were transported using sledges, wooden platforms. And these sledges, they were not dragged across the stone and earth dry. Instead, workers sprayed water on the sand ahead of the sledges. Water reduces friction, makes surfaces more slippery, more navigable. This technique, which we might consider obvious to modern engineers, was a brilliant adaptation to the climate and materials available. The stones were moved by teams of men, dozens of them, hundreds of them, working in coordinated effort, not through magic, not through any superhuman power, but through human ingenuity and human determination and human bodies, working together day after day, season after season. And the remarkable thing is, we have evidence of this labor. In later periods, tomb paintings show teams of workers pulling sledges. We can see the work gangs themselves, and in quarries, we can still see the marks left by copper tools, the ancient scars of labor. The construction of the step pyramid took years, perhaps a decade, perhaps longer. Men died during its construction. Men were injured. Men worked in the heat of the Egyptian sun, a heat that can be lethal, and some of them did not return home to their families. But they were part of the construction nonetheless. This was the beginning of the Old Kingdom. And what happened next was perhaps even more remarkable. The Fourth Dynasty began around 2590 years before our era. It lasted for less than 200 years. In that brief span of time, in less than 2 centuries, the Egyptians built the 3 largest pyramids ever constructed. The first was the Red Pyramid, built by Senefru, a pharaoh whose reign was marked by peace and prosperity. It rose to a height of over 300 feet, and it was immediately followed, by something even more audacious. Khufu was the son of Senefru. He inherited a kingdom at peace, a kingdom with resources, a kingdom of engineers and workers who had learned through the construction of the Step Pyramid and the Red Pyramid how to do the impossible. And Khufu decided to surpass his father, the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is difficult to describe this structure with words, because words cannot quite capture its scale, its perfection, its impossibility. But let me try. The Great Pyramid is composed of approximately 2.3 million blocks of stone. Each block weighs an average of 2½ tons. Some weigh as much as 80 tons. These blocks were quarried, transported, and placed with such precision that when ancient stonemasons worked on it, when they added the facing stones that would have covered the entire structure in smooth, gleaming white limestone, they used mortar so thin that you could not slide a papyrus leaf into the gaps. The base of the pyramid covers 13 acres. If you could somehow stretch a piece of rope, a rope 13 acres in length, and lay it in a square, that is the footprint of this monument, and it stands 481 feet tall. At the time it was built, 4,500 years ago, it was the tallest human-made structure in the world. And it remained the tallest structure for 3,800 years. That is almost 4,000 years, with no human creation exceeding its height. Think about that. For nearly 4,000 years, no human being built anything taller. The precision of its construction is equally astounding. The base is level, perfectly level, to within a few inches across 13 acres. The angles of the sides are all equal. The orientation is almost precisely aligned to true north. When you stand before the Great Pyramid, when you place your hand upon its stones, you are touching something that represents the absolute peak of ancient construction technology. And it was built with copper tools, with wooden sledges, with human hands. It was built between approximately 2,580 and 2,560 years before our era. The construction took around 20 years, and it contained at its heart a burial chamber for the king. Who was Khufu? What kind of man was he? We know very little, truly. We have some statues, some inscriptions, but little of his personality survives. What survives is his monument, his obsession with eternity, his determination to build something that would outlast kingdoms, outlast religions, outlast entire civilizations. And he succeeded. The Great Pyramid still stands. The world has changed. Empires have risen and fallen. Religions have been born and transformed and died and been reborn. The Mediterranean has swallowed cities. Deserts have advanced and retreated. Ice ages have come and gone. But the Great Pyramid remains, 4,500 years old and standing still. After Khufu, his son Khafre built his own pyramid, not quite as large, but the second most impressive monument of the era. And then Menkaure, and then the dynasty faded. The golden age of pyramid construction waned. Why? The answer is mundane and human. It is a lesson in the cost of ambition. The construction of these monuments required resources. It required stone. It required workers. It required food to feed those workers. It required coordination and management. With each successive pyramid, with each generation of pharaohs desiring to build ever larger tombs, the resources required grew greater. The kingdom's focus turned inward, toward the monuments, and away from other concerns. The gods, or so the priests said, grew hungry for these monuments. The pharaohs grew obsessed with their eternal afterlives. And meanwhile, in villages and towns throughout Egypt, the common people, the farmers and laborers and merchants, their concerns seemed to matter less. The Old Kingdom lasted for roughly 500 years, from around 2700 to 2100 years before our era. It was an age of monuments and centralized power, an age of builders and dreamers, an age when, it seems, the entire force of civilization was directed toward stone, toward height, toward beating death itself through the permanence of architecture. But even absolute power has limits, and even monuments, eventually, cast shadows. The Old Kingdom ended around 2100 years before our era. The collapse, when it came, was not sudden. It was gradual, like a sunset, a slow fading of centralized power. Several factors contributed to the decline. The climate of Egypt became drier. The annual floods of the Nile, which had been so reliably abundant, became less dependable. Harvests suffered, famines came, and as food became scarcer, as the riches that had flowed to the pharaoh's treasuries began to diminish, the authority of the kingship itself began to weaken. Additionally, the priesthood had grown wealthy and powerful. The priests who managed the temples and oversaw the religious ceremonies had been granted lands and resources by grateful pharaohs. Over generations, this wealth accumulated. The priests became a power unto themselves, sometimes rivaling the pharaoh's authority. The centralized state began to fracture. By around 2100 years before our era, Egypt had broken apart into several regional kingdoms. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt were no longer unified under a single supreme ruler. Instead, local governors called nomarchs ruled over their own territories almost as independent kingdoms. It was a time of chaos, a time when the grand structures of the Old Kingdom seemed like relics of a golden age that had passed. Historians call this the First Intermediate Period. It lasted for roughly 150 years. A time of darkness, a time when the lights of centralized civilization seemed to have been extinguished. But then, around 2100 years before our era, something remarkable happened. A family of rulers from the city of Thebes in Upper Egypt began to consolidate power, slowly, carefully. They were not conquerors in the grand tradition of earlier pharaohs. They were strategists. They allied with other rulers. They made marriage alliances. They built support gradually. And by around 1995 years before our era, a pharaoh named Amenemhat III had reunified Egypt. The Middle Kingdom had begun. It was to be an age very different from the Old Kingdom. Rather than monuments built in the sky, rather than pyramids reaching toward heaven, the Middle Kingdom was an age of stability, an age of culture, an age when attention turned not only upward toward the gods and eternity, but inward toward the people, toward art, toward the everyday concerns of living well in this world. The new pharaohs still built pyramids, but they were smaller, less obsessive. made not because the pharaoh was consumed with his own immortality, but because it was expected, because tradition demanded it. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs looked back at the great pyramids of the Old Kingdom and seemed to say, "We have learned, we understand what can be built, but we choose differently now." There's a text called the Tale of Sinuhe, written during this era. It tells the story of an official who flees Egypt, afraid of a conspiracy against the new pharaoh. He travels to Asia, lives abroad, has adventures and children and a full life. But eventually he returns home driven by homesickness, by a longing to be buried in his homeland, to return at last to the Nile and the Black Land. Reading this tale, you realize something remarkable. You realize that the people who wrote it understood human nature. They understood wanderlust and homesickness. They understood loyalty and fear and redemption. They were not so different from us. The Middle Kingdom was also an age of administrative sophistication. The government developed a bureaucracy, a system of administration that allowed power to be exercised without the pharaoh necessarily being personally involved in every decision. Tax collectors were appointed. Officials managed provinces. Scribes recorded everything. An enormous amount of our knowledge of Middle Kingdom Egypt comes from the records they left behind. Clay tablets and papyri documenting the mundane details of governance. And this tells us something important. The Middle Kingdom was not an age of universal peace. There were disputes. There were tax problems. There were rebellions and unrest. The pharaohs had to manage conflicts between different regions. They had to navigate the interests of the priesthood. But they did this through administration and law, not primarily through the overwhelming display of power that had characterized the Old Kingdom. Art during the Middle Kingdom shows a new realism. The sculptors and painters of the Old Kingdom had created idealized images of pharaohs and nobles, eternally young, eternally perfect, eternally powerful. But Middle Kingdom art began to show people as they actually were. There are statues of rulers where you can see the weight of age upon their faces, where their skin shows the marks of time, where they are depicted not as immortal gods, but as human beings carrying the burdens of leadership. Amenemhat III, one of the great pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, ruled for around 45 years. In his lifetime, he undertook irrigation projects. He extended Egyptian control into Nubia to the south, where gold and other valuable resources could be obtained. He established trade relationships with cities along the Mediterranean coast. He built temples not as monuments to his own eternity, but as places of worship, as centers of religious and community life. And in his tombs, in the monuments erected in his name, you can sense a different philosophy. Not, "I will build something so large that it can never be forgotten." Rather, "I will live a long and productive life. I will do good works. I will be remembered." The Middle Kingdom lasted for approximately 300 years, from around 1995 to 1730 years before our era. And when it came to an end, the reasons were somewhat similar to the decline of the Old Kingdom. Again, the climate became drier. Again, the floods became less reliable. Again, famine stalked the land. And again, centralized power began to weaken. Regional rulers began to consolidate local power, and foreign groups, primarily people from the Levant, from what is now Israel and Syria and Lebanon, began to infiltrate the Delta region in the north. By around 1700 years before our era, the Middle Kingdom had ended, and Egypt again experienced a period of fragmentation and chaos called the Second Intermediate Period. But this time, it would not last as long, and when Egypt reunified, it would emerge transformed, hardened, militarized, ready to dominate not only the Nile Valley, but the ancient Near East. Around 1650 years before our era, a family of rulers from Thebes, the same city that had produced the Middle Kingdom pharaohs, began to consolidate power once again. The Second Intermediate Period had seen foreign rulers, the Hyksos as they would be called, controlling parts of northern Egypt. The Egyptians, who had been somewhat insular, who had thought of themselves as civilized and superior to the desert peoples around them, found themselves conquered. Foreign rulers sat on thrones that Egyptians believed should only belong to native-born pharaohs. This was humiliating. This was intolerable. A pharaoh named Ahmose began to organize the reconquest. He gathered armies, he used copper weapons, far superior to the weapons of stone and bronze that the Egyptians had relied upon in earlier ages, and he drove the Hyksos out of Egypt. He pursued them eastward, he extended Egypt's borders beyond the Nile Valley for the first time, into the Levant, into Nubia. By around 1525 years before our era, Egypt was unified again under native Egyptian rule. And this new age, the New Kingdom, would be the most militaristic and expansionistic age in Egyptian history. It would be an age of warrior pharaohs, an age of conquest, an age when Egypt's borders stretched from deep within Africa to the borders of the Middle East. The early New Kingdom saw the rise of some of Egypt's greatest rulers. Thutmose I expanded the empire. Thutmose III, often called Thutmose the Great, became one of the most celebrated military commanders in all of ancient history. He undertook 17 military campaigns. He expanded Egyptian control into Syria. He brought Nubia firmly under Egyptian dominion. Gold, ivory, incense, resources flowed back to Egypt from these conquered territories. But then, around 1490 years before our era, something unusual happened. A woman became pharaoh. Her name was Hatshepsut, and she was one of the most remarkable figures in Egyptian history. She was not born to be pharaoh. She was the daughter of Thutmose I, and wives often had significant influence, but it was rare for a woman to take the throne herself. But when her husband, her brother, following Egyptian royal custom, died without a clear adult heir, Hatshepsut stepped in, and she did not simply act as regent for her young son. She claimed the throne herself. She declared herself pharaoh. And more than that, she declared that she had always been meant to be pharaoh. She had her statues and reliefs altered to show her wearing the false beard of the pharaoh, the traditional mark of kingship. She presented herself as the chosen daughter of the gods. And somehow, through intelligence and political acumen and the respect of her officials and priests, she succeeded. She ruled for over 20 years. Hatshepsut was not a military conqueror in the manner of Thutmose III. Instead, she was a builder and a diplomat. She organized a great trading expedition to the mysterious land of Punt, located somewhere on the coast of what is now Somalia or Eritrea. The expedition returned with valuable goods, gold, incense, exotic animals, and Hatshepsut made sure that images of this expedition were recorded on the walls of her mortuary temple, her monument to herself and her achievements. This temple, located across the Nile from Thebes, at a place called Deir el-Bahari, is one of the greatest architectural achievements in all of Egypt. It rises in 3 terraces, elegant columns, fine reliefs. It is not the monument of someone obsessed with displaying power through sheer size. It is the monument of someone confident enough in her achievements that she could be subtle, could be elegant, could let beauty speak for itself. Hatshepsut ruled until around 1460 years before our era, and then she disappeared from history. Literally. Her successor, her stepson Thutmose III, who had been waiting in the wings for over 20 years, seems to have deliberately erased her from the historical record. Her statues were destroyed. Her name was removed from inscriptions. Her monuments were defaced. It was as if he could not bear to acknowledge that a woman had ruled Egypt. But the ancient world was persistent. In the 20th century, in our modern era, archaeologists found her remains, they found her temples, they found her records, and Hatshepsut was restored to history, no longer forgotten. After Hatshepsut and the 3 Thutmoses, the New Kingdom continued to flourish. But around 1400 years before our era, a new dynasty began. The 18th dynasty, which had included Hatshepsut and the Thutmoses, had come to an end. And the 19th dynasty began, and with it came some of Egypt's most famous pharaohs. Most famous among them was a man named Amenhotep III. He is sometimes called Amenhotep the Magnificent, and he ruled from roughly 1400 to approximately 1352 years before our era. During his reign, Egypt reached perhaps its greatest height of wealth and power. Amenhotep III was a builder. He constructed the 3rd pylon at the Temple of Amon at Karnak. He built the mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, and he decorated these structures with images of himself and his accomplishments, showing his dominance over foreign lands, showing the abundance that flowed from his rule. But Amenhotep III was also something else. He was a lover of beauty. He married a woman not of royal blood, a woman named Tia. And in the reliefs that show them together, you can see something remarkable. You can see them displaying affection, not the cold, formal presentation of royal power, but actual warmth, actual connection. Their son would become perhaps the most fascinating pharaoh in all of Egyptian history, a man who broke with tradition, a man who changed religion, a man who created a revolution and then disappeared from history, erased like Hatshepsut by those who came after him. His name was Akhenaten. Akhenaten ascended to the throne around 1353 years before our era. He was born with another name, Amenhotep, but he would change that name. He would change everything. For over 1,000 years, since at least the time of the Old Kingdom, Egypt's religion had been centered on many gods. Amun was chief among them, Amun-Ra, the sun god. But there were others: Osiris, god of the afterlife; Isis, goddess of magic and motherhood; Thoth, god of wisdom; Bastet, goddess with the head of a cat, and dozens more. The priesthood of Amun had become extraordinarily powerful. The temples and priests controlled vast lands. Massive portions of Egypt's wealth flowed to the temples, and this wealth meant power. But the new young pharaoh, the man who would become Akhenaten, seems to have been possessed by a different vision. He believed that there was one God, one supreme deity, the Aten, the sun disk, and that this God alone deserved worship. This was revolutionary. This was, in some ways, the first monotheistic theology in human history. One God, universal, all-encompassing, more radical than anything the ancient world had seen before. But more than that, Akhenaten moved the capital of Egypt. He left Thebes, where the priesthood of Amun was strongest, and he founded a new city, a city specifically designed for the worship of the Aten. He called it Akhetaten, city of the horizon of the Aten. Scholars have identified this city with a place in modern Egypt called Tel El Amarna. This new city was built quickly, using sandstone rather than the more traditional granite and limestone. It rose in the desert, a new capital, a statement of religious revolution, and Akhenaten moved there with his family. His wife Nefertiti, one of the most beautiful women in all of ancient history if the sculptures and paintings are accurate, his daughters, his court, for a moment, for a brief window of perhaps 2 decades, Akhenaten transformed Egypt. He changed the art. The reliefs no longer showed the idealized pharaoh of tradition. Instead, they showed Akhenaten and Nefertiti as they actually were, sometimes informal, sometimes showing physical characteristics that earlier pharaohs would have never permitted: a long face, a strange physique. Some scholars have suggested he suffered from a hereditary condition. Others simply say he chose to be shown truthfully. He wrote poetry praising the Aten. How beautiful is your appearing in the eastern horizon of the sky. You fill every land with your beauty. Your rays embrace all creation. It is intimate. It is joyful. It is a theology of light and life and the visible sun itself, not a distant, theoretical God, but the warm sun that every person experiences every day. But Akhenaten made an error. He was too radical. He moved too fast. He attacked the established priesthood of Amun too directly. He demanded that the worship of the other gods cease. In a land where religious tradition stretched back for 1,000 years, this was intolerable, and he seems to have been, personally, a somewhat unworldly figure. He was a visionary, a poet, a dreamer, but he was not necessarily skilled at the practical arts of statecraft. While he was composing poetry to the Aten, while he was building his new city, while he was transforming religion, the borders of Egypt's empire were becoming neglected. Enemies pressed inward, vassal states rebelled. The administration of the empire required attention, and Akhenaten seems to have given it little. After perhaps 17 years of rule, Akhenaten died. We are not entirely sure of the cause. He was not old. He was in his late 20s or 30s, and he simply vanished from history. And what happened next is one of the most deliberate erasures in all of ancient history. His successor, a young boy, possibly his son, possibly just a court official, took the throne, a young man named Tutankhaten, and the priests of Amun moved swiftly. They reversed everything Akhenaten had done. The Aten was abandoned as the supreme god. Amun-Ra was restored to prominence. The capital was moved back to Thebes, and Akhenaten's name was literally chiseled off monuments. His image was defaced. His city, that beautiful new city of Akhetaten, was abandoned, left to the desert. It was as if Akhenaten had never been, as if his revolution had been a strange dream, a moment of madness. But Akhenaten was still remembered, if only because he was erased so completely that later historians realized something extraordinary had happened. And in the 20th century, when archaeologists explored the site of Akhetaten, when they found the remains of his city, when they uncovered statues and reliefs showing his revolution, Akhenaten was restored to history. The young boy who succeeded him, Tutankhaten, would change his name to Tutankhamun. He would reign for only about 9 years before dying at around 18 or 19 years old. He is famous today not because of his reign, which was unremarkable, but because his tomb was discovered intact in the 20th century. His body was found, his treasures were found, and his face, bandaged in linen, preserved through the centuries, emerged into the light again. But his reign marked the end of this revolutionary moment. It marked the restoration of traditional authority, and it prepared the way for the greatest military pharaohs of all. The 19th dynasty began around 1304 years before our era, and with it came a new line of pharaohs who would dominate Egypt for nearly 2 centuries. The first was Ramesses I, though his reign was relatively short. But his son, Seti I, continued the restoration of Egyptian power. He extended military control. He fought the Hittites, a powerful empire to the north, and he began the construction of one of Egypt's most famous temples, the Temple of Abydos, dedicated to Osiris, god of the afterlife. But the most famous of all the Ramesses rulers was his son, the man who became Ramesses II, and he would rule for approximately 66 years, from around 1303 to 1213 years before our era. Ramesses II is sometimes called Ramesses the Great, and he was one of the most prolific builders and self-promoters in all of Egyptian history. If Egypt in the Old Kingdom was defined by the monument of Khufu's Great Pyramid, Egypt in the New Kingdom was defined by the monuments of Ramesses II. He built monuments throughout Egypt. He expanded and decorated the Temple of Ammon at Karnak. He constructed the Ramesseum, his mortuary temple, and most famously, he constructed the great temple at Abu Simbel in Nubia, where 4 colossal statues of himself were carved directly into a cliff face. Each statue is 67 feet tall. Each statue is a representation of Ramesses, eternally guarding the southern border of his empire. The most famous story associated with Ramesses II is his conflict with the Hittites. Around 1274 years before our era, Ramesses led a massive military force northward toward the territory of the Hittites. He intended to reconquer the region of Canaan, but the Hittite king, Muwatalli, had also assembled a great force. The 2 armies met near a river called the Orontes, at a place called Kadesh, and here occurred one of the greatest battles of the ancient world. The Egyptian army was divided into 4 divisions, each named after a different god. Ramesses himself led the division of Ammon. As the Egyptian forces advanced, they encountered a smaller contingent of Hittites and defeated them. Believing the Hittite army to be broken and fleeing, Ramesses and his division continued forward. But this was a trap. Suddenly, the main Hittite force emerged, fresh, organized, and they fell upon Ramesses' division. The Egyptian force was surrounded, trapped, and in a moment of profound danger, a moment when the entire division seemed about to be annihilated, Ramesses himself stepped into the fray. In the reliefs that commemorate this battle, carved on the walls of his temples, Ramesses is shown on his chariot, bow in hand, raining arrows down upon the Hittites. The images are propaganda, certainly, designed to show the pharaoh as a warrior, as invincible. But they are based on actual events. And in that moment of danger, whether through Ramesses' personal courage or the rallying of his forces around him, or simply the arrival of reinforcements, the tide turned. The Hittites were pushed back. The battle ended in what was, technically, perhaps a draw. Neither side had decisively defeated the other. But Ramesses declared victory. He returned to Egypt and had the battle commemorated on his monuments. And then, something remarkable happened. Rather than continuing to war with the Hittites indefinitely, Rameses and the Hittite king made peace. They signed a treaty, the first great peace treaty in recorded history. It was carved into stone, it set boundaries, it established that the territory of Canaan would be divided between the two powers, and it brought an end to the long conflict between Egypt and the Hittites. This treaty tells us something important about Ramesses II. He was not merely a warmonger, he was a pragmatist. He understood that conflicts can be ended through negotiation. That peace, even a negotiated peace in which neither side gains everything, is better than endless war. Ramesses II lived a very long life for the ancient world. He fathered over 100 children, he took multiple wives, and he lived to see the death of many of his own sons, watching as his throne eventually passed to a much younger successor. But the remarkable thing, the thing that made him perhaps the most famous pharaoh in all of Egypt, was his construction. His monuments, his inscriptions, his face, immortalized in stone, appeared everywhere. And because he lived so long, because his reign lasted so long, he had time to complete vast projects. He wanted to be remembered, and he succeeded. 4,000 years after his death, people still speak his name. People still visit his temples. People still see his face carved in stone. He achieved what every pharaoh dreamed of. He achieved immortality. Not the magical immortality that the pharaohs believed in, not life in the afterlife, but immortality through memory, through lasting impact. After Rameses II, there were other Rameses rulers. Rameses III, who came several generations later, was a powerful military leader. But gradually, the power of the pharaohs began to decline. The priesthood of Amun grew richer and more powerful. The empire fragmented, and the new kingdom, that brilliant age of warrior pharaohs and monument builders, began to fade. By around 1000 years before our era, the 20th dynasty was ending, and Egypt's days as a dominant world power were nearly over. We have spoken of pharaohs and monuments, of kings and conquest, of pyramids and temples. But in all of this, we must not forget something essential. We must not forget the people. For every monument, there were hundreds of people who built it. For every pharaoh who ruled, there were tens of thousands of people who lived out their lives in the shadow of that rule. And these people, these common Egyptians, left traces of themselves behind, in tomb paintings, in household objects, in the very stones and structures they built. Let us imagine a day in the life of an Egyptian. Not a great person, not a noble or a priest, but an ordinary person. A farmer living along the Nile around 3,500 years ago, during the New Kingdom. The day begins before dawn. Your body is accustomed to early rising. Around you, your family sleeps, your wife, your children, perhaps aging parents. Your house is made of mud brick, not grand but sturdy. The walls are thick enough to keep out the worst of the summer heat. You have a small courtyard, a few rooms, a roof where in summer during the hottest months you might sleep to catch the cooler air of night. You step outside, the air is still cool, still holding some of the night's relief from the heat. The sky is beginning to pale in the east, just the first hints of dawn. You make your way to the fields, to your plot of land, that black soil that the Nile provides. If this is the season of inundation, if the river is currently at flood, you might not be working in your fields. The water would be too high. Instead, you might be part of a work gang, obligated to work on the pharaoh's projects, building dikes, repairing irrigation channels. Or perhaps, if the pharaoh is building a great monument, you might be working on that, dragging stones, mixing mud, helping to construct something that will last forever, even though you yourself will not. But let us say this is the season of growth, the season after the floods have receded and the seeds have been planted. You are checking your fields, looking for weeds, watching for pests. The work is not glamorous, it is repetitive. Your back aches, your hands become rough, but you understand its importance. You understand that the food you grow is not just for you. It is collected by tax officials, stored in royal granaries, distributed to feed the city dwellers. The priests, the workers on royal projects. This is the system that sustains Egypt. Your wife, let us imagine her name is Nefret, which simply means beautiful. She is at home. She has risen early as well. She begins her day with water from the well, or perhaps a servant brings it to her. She lights a fire for cooking. She prepares bread, the staple of the Egyptian diet. Bread is made from grain that you grew. It is more than just food, it is payment. Government workers might be paid in bread rather than precious metals. Bread is currency. Bread is life. She might also prepare beer. Yes, beer. In ancient Egypt, beer was not a luxury item. It was a beverage that everyone drank, even children, because water was often unsafe. The fermentation process made it safer, and beer provided calories, nourishment. Her day is full of labor. She tends to your children. She spins flax into linen. Linen is the fabric of Egypt, grown from the flax plant. It is woven on looms that have existed, essentially unchanged, for centuries. The work is tedious and repetitive, but linen is valuable. It is not just for clothing. It is wrapped around the bodies of the dead. It is used in temple ceremonies. She is creating something that has value throughout the society. Your children, let us say you have 3, they are learning. The older boy might be learning a craft from his father or an uncle, a trade. If he is fortunate, he might become a scribe. Reading and writing are rare skills. A scribe can rise in society. A scribe can work for the government. A scribe can have a better life than a farmer. Your daughters, they are learning household skills from their mother. How to cook, how to spin, how to manage a household, how to raise children when they have children of their own. And yet, despite the hard work, there are moments of joy. On festival days, you might go to town. There are celebrations honoring the gods. There are markets where goods are traded, vegetables, fish, beer, linen, pottery, tools. You might meet friends. You might even enjoy music and dancing. The Egyptians loved music. They had various instruments, harps, lyres, drums, and in tomb paintings we can see scenes of celebration, of dancing, of people finding joy even in difficult lives. On market days you might purchase something special, a piece of jewelry, a new tool, something that was crafted by a specialist, an artisan whose work is valued. Class structure in Egypt was rigid. You were born as a farmer, and almost certainly you would die as a farmer. Your son might rise above you if he became a scribe, but you could not simply decide to become a priest or a noble. This was not possible. And yet, despite this rigidity, there was a certain fluidity. A good farmer could become a prosperous farmer. A scribe could become an official. An official could become a judge. There were paths upward, narrow paths, but they existed. And across the river, across the great river that gives life, in the city of Thebes or Memphis, other people were living other lives. Merchants buying and selling, priests performing rituals, craftspeople creating art, soldiers training for war, administrators managing the empire. And if you were not fortunate, if you were poor, you might fall into servitude. Slavery was common in Egypt, but even slavery was more complex than in other societies. Slaves had certain rights. They could own property, they could work off their debt, they could sometimes earn their freedom. Death, when it came, was not the end of concern. The Egyptians believed in an afterlife, and to ensure a good afterlife, they saved. They prepared. Money that a farmer saved across a lifetime went to prepare the tomb, to ensure proper burial, to ensure that the body would be preserved, to ensure that the journey to the afterlife would be successful. Even a poor farmer would be mummified, at least to some degree. And with the body, items would be placed, tools for the afterlife, food, furniture, images painted on the tomb walls showing the life that had been lived. Here I am, the tomb seems to say. I existed, I lived, I worked, I loved. Remember me. And the remarkable thing is the tomb paintings are remembered. We do remember them. 4,000 years later, we look at these images of ordinary people, and we see them. We understand them. We recognize something of ourselves in them. They are gone. Their names are mostly forgotten, but their images, their moments, are preserved. And through those images, we know they lived. They mattered. They left marks on the world that have lasted beyond empires. By around 1300 years before our era, the height of Egyptian power was passing. The Ramesside period, the era of Ramesses II and his successors, had established Egyptian dominance throughout the Mediterranean and Near East. But the seeds of decline had already been sown. Several factors contributed to the slow fading of Egyptian power. The climate of Egypt continued to change. The Nile's floods, while still reliable, began to fluctuate more dramatically. Harvests failed. Famines came. The granaries, which had been built and maintained to help Egypt survive lean times, became depleted. The riches that had flowed to the pharaohs from conquered territories began to diminish. Additionally, the priesthood of Amun had become extraordinarily wealthy and powerful. By the end of the 20th dynasty, around 1150 years before our era, the high priests of Amun controlled as much wealth as the pharaoh himself. They had become a state within the state, and the pharaoh's authority, once absolute, had been significantly curtailed. The military, too, began to weaken. The great standing armies that had conquered Canaan and fought the Hittites were expensive to maintain, and as resources dwindled, so did the military capability. Egypt was no longer able to project power outward with the same authority it once had. Around 1100 years before our era, Egypt fragmented again. The Central Kingdom, what historians call the later period, was a time when unified pharaonic rule began to break down. Upper Egypt, governed by the high priests of Thebes, became essentially independent. Lower Egypt in the north was governed by pharaohs based in the Delta region. For centuries, Egypt was divided, and as Egypt was divided, as the pharaohs lost power, foreign rulers began to move in. Around 950 years before our era, a dynasty of Libyan origin took power in Egypt. The Libyans were peoples from the lands to the west of Egypt. For centuries, they had been infiltrating Egypt, some as mercenaries, some as settlers. Eventually, one of their leaders declared himself pharaoh, and for a time they ruled, but they too eventually faded. Then came the Nubian period. Rulers from Nubia from far to the south conquered Egypt. They established their own dynasty, but their hold on power was weak. The tradition of Egyptian pharaohs was still strong, and local rulers continued to claim the throne, even as foreign powers vied for control. Around 664 years before our era, a dynasty from the city of Sais in the Delta managed to reunify Egypt. Briefly, for about 130 years, there was again a unified Egyptian state. And this period, the late period, saw an interesting phenomenon. The Egyptians began to look backward. They began to study the art and architecture of earlier periods. They deliberately created new monuments in the styles of the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom. They did not see themselves as creating something new. They saw themselves as restoration, as returning to a golden age. In a way, this was nostalgic. This was a people aware that they were declining, aware that they would never again achieve the heights of the new kingdom, and therefore turning their attention to copying the past. And then, around 525 years before our era, the Persians conquered Egypt. A powerful empire, the Persian Empire, swept across the Near East. Egypt, weakened by division and internal conflict, could not resist. The Persian king incorporated Egypt into his empire. The tradition of Egyptian pharaohs continued briefly. The Persian king officially became pharaoh, but real power lay in Persia. Egypt remained under Persian rule for about 130 years. Then there was a brief period of independence when a native Egyptian dynasty rose to power. But that independence was short-lived. Around 332 years before our era, a new conqueror arrived. His name was Alexander the Great. Alexander was a young Macedonian king who had inherited the kingdom of Macedonia from his father Philip. And at the age of 24, having already conquered much of the Near East, Alexander arrived in Egypt. His army defeated the Persian garrison, and the Egyptians, seeing an end to Persian rule, welcomed him. Alexander traveled to the temple of Amun at Siwa, a sacred oracle in the desert, and there, in the temple, the priests proclaimed him the son of Amun, the legitimate heir to the pharaohs. And Alexander, who had been raised on Greek culture but was shrewd enough to understand the importance of tradition and legitimacy, accepted this. He became pharaoh. But Alexander did not remain in Egypt. He had an empire to build. He left Egypt in the hands of a general named Ptolemy. And after Alexander's death, a few years later, Ptolemy declared himself the ruler of Egypt. He and his descendants, the Ptolemaic dynasty, would rule Egypt for 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Greek, not Egyptian. They spoke Greek. They maintained Greek culture, but they also presented themselves as pharaohs. They adopted Egyptian names. They were crowned as pharaohs in the traditional manner. They were a hybrid, a fusion of Greek and Egyptian. For 300 years, this worked. But the world was changing. Rome was rising. Rome was becoming the dominant power in the Mediterranean, and Egypt, no longer the great power it had once been, was increasingly pulled into Rome's sphere of influence. By around 100 years before our era, the Ptolemaic dynasty was weakening. There was internal conflict, there were weak rulers, and Rome was circling, waiting for an opportunity. And then came a woman named Cleopatra. Cleopatra VII came to power around 51 years before our era. She was brilliant, she was educated, she understood languages, possibly as many as 9 different languages. And she understood something that her predecessors had not fully grasped, that Egypt's survival depended on aligning with Rome. She formed an alliance with Julius Caesar. They had a child together, and when Caesar was assassinated, when Rome fell into civil war, she aligned with another Roman leader, Mark Antony. It was a calculated alliance, a strategy to keep Egypt independent even as Rome dominated the Mediterranean. But in the end, it was not enough. Octavian, who would later become Caesar Augustus, defeated Mark Antony. And in 30 years before our era, Cleopatra, facing the loss of everything, chose to end her life. Some accounts say she allowed herself to be bitten by an asp, a snake. Others say she poisoned herself. The exact cause is uncertain. But her death marked an end. It marked the moment when Egypt ceased to be an independent nation. It became a province of Rome. The temple of Egypt's glory, the age of the pharaohs, was officially over. And yet, even in death, Egypt's influence persisted. The Egyptians had built monuments that would last forever. They had created art and literature that would be preserved. They had recorded their history and their beliefs and their stories in a way that would survive millennia. 4,000 years later, long after Rome fell, long after the Roman Empire transformed into Christian kingdoms, long after the medieval period, long after the modern era was born, people still looked upon Egypt with wonder. People still visited the pyramids. People still studied the hieroglyphic inscriptions. People still marveled at the wisdom and achievements of a civilization that had flourished so long ago. The pharaohs had wanted immortality, and in a way, they had achieved it. Not the magical immortality of the afterlife that they believed in, but a different kind. They achieved permanence in human memory. They achieved a place in the story of civilization. They achieved a kind of eternity through stone and ink and human remembrance. And now, as we reach the end of our journey through time, let us begin the long return to the present moment. You have traveled far, backward through thousands of years, through dust and stone and the lives of hundreds of millions of people, through the rise and fall of an empire, through the dreams and achievements of those who believed they could build forever. Let that travel rest now. Feel your body again. Feel where you are resting. Feel the weight of your head upon the pillow. Feel your hands, your arms, the surface beneath you. You are safe. You are here. You are in this moment, this modern moment, thousands of years from the Nile and the pharaohs. But that Egypt, that ancient world, it is not gone. It is only distant. The monuments still stand. The stories still exist. The wisdom still resonates. You have carried it with you in your mind. And in a way, you carry it still. The pharaohs wanted to be remembered. They built to be remembered. They inscribed their names in stone to be remembered. And they succeeded, not through magic, but through making something so solid, so permanent, so beautiful, that humans could not help but remember. You too will leave marks. Not monuments of stone, perhaps, but marks nonetheless. In the people you touch, in the kindness you show, in the things you create and the words you speak. In the time you take to simply be present in another person's life. These too are monuments. These too are eternal in their way. And now, as the weight of Egypt's history settles into your deeper mind, as the centuries become dreams, I invite you to let go, to release the journey, to allow sleep to come naturally, without force, without grasping, like the Nile in the dry season, like the sands of the desert at dusk, like the slow closing of an ancient temple door at evening. Your breathing is calm, your mind is quiet, the world outside is muted. There is no urgency, there is no demand upon you. There is only this moment, this rest, this allowing of stillness. If you are still conscious, and you may be, do not fight sleep, do not reach for it, let it come as it will. Let your awareness fade like starlight fading as dawn approaches. Let thoughts pass like clouds across an Egyptian sky. Present one moment, gone the next. You are held by time itself. You are held by the earth. You are held by the patience of an ancient river that still flows, still giving life, still faithful to its course. And in this holding, in this safety, allow yourself to surrender. Sleep well. Single male narrator, age 35, 50 years old. Warm, contemplative tone, beginning at dB baseline, gradually decreasing in volume over the course of the script, approximately 3 dB, 6 dB by final sections. Natural breath marks at all markers, 4-second silence at all markers, 10-second silence at all markers. Opening meditation, very soft papyrus rustling and distant Nile water sounds, fade out after first 2 minutes. Main narration, silent or extremely subtle ambient background, below 40 dB if present. Closing meditation, very subtle distant water sounds or desert ambience, optional, below 35 dB. Opening meditation, 1,1100 characters. Part 1, Origins and Unification, 6,800 characters. Part 2, Old Kingdom, 7,200 characters. Part 3, Middle Kingdom, 6,900 characters. Part 4, New Kingdom Rise, Tau 6,800 characters. Part 5, Akhenaten and Revolution, 6,500 characters. Part 6, Ramesses and Power, 6,900 characters. Part 7, Daily Life, 7,100 characters. Part 8, Decline and End, 6,400 characters. Closing Meditation, 1,100 characters. All dates referenced in this script follow the scholarly consensus regarding ancient Egyptian chronology, using years before Common Era, BCE. The dating of ancient Egypt remains subject to scholarly debate, with variations of 50 to 100 years common for events more than 2,000 years old. This script uses the following generally accepted framework. Early Dynastic Period, c. 3100 to 2686 BCE. Old Kingdom, c. 2686 to 2181 BCE. First Intermediate Period, c. 2181 to 2055 BCE. Middle Kingdom, 2055 to 1650 BCE. Second Intermediate Period, c. 1650-1550 BCE. New Kingdom, c. 1550-1069 BCE. Late Period, c. 6164 to 332 BCE. Key figures and events referenced: Narmer-Menes, c. 3100 BCE. Unification. Djoser and Imhotep, c. 2670-650 BCE. Step Pyramid. Khufu, c. 2589 to 566 BCE. Great Pyramid. Hatshepsut, c. 1479 to 1458 BCE. Thutmose Thrur, c. 1479 to 1425 BCE. Amenhotep Thrur, c. 1390-1352 BCE. Akhenaten, c. 1353 to 1336 BCE. Tutankhamun, c. 1332 to 1323 BCE. Ramesses Tep, c. 1279 to 1213 CE. Battle of Kadesh, c. 1274 BCE. Ptolemaic Period, 323 to 30 BCE. Cleopatra VII, 51 to 30 BCE. None. This script contains no graphic violence, explicit content, or disturbing material. It is suitable for all audiences, including children in appropriate listening contexts. Sleep and relaxation, meditation and mindfulness, study background, long-distance driving for alert listeners, classroom educational listening, history enthusiasts and curious learners, ancient history courses, supplementary material. Journey through 3,000 years of history as we explore the rise, glory, and transformation of ancient Egypt. From the life-giving Nile to the magnificent pharaohs, from the construction of the pyramids to the daily lives of ordinary Egyptians, this immersive narration takes you through one of history's greatest civilizations, perfect for sleep, relaxation, meditation, or focused study. No ads, no interruptions, just the timeless story of Egypt unfolding at a gentle pace. The origins of Egyptian civilization and the role of the Nile River. The Old Kingdom and the construction of the pyramids, Djoser, Khufu, Imhotep. The Middle Kingdom and cultural flourishing. The New Kingdom, military expansion and empire building. Hatshepsut, ancient Egypt's powerful female pharaoh, Akhenaten's religious revolution. Ramesses the Great and the temples of Abu Simbel. Daily life in ancient Egypt, farmers, families, and ordinary people. The gradual decline of pharaonic Egypt and the arrival of foreign rulers. Cleopatra and the end of pharaonic independence. Ancient Egypt, Egypt history, pharaohs, pyramids, Ramesses, Cleopatra, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Nile River, History for sleep, sleep stories, relaxation, meditation. Historical narration, educational, documentary. Sleep enthusiasts, 25 to 65 years old. History students and professionals. Lifelong learners, meditation and relaxation seekers. People interested in ancient civilizations, educators seeking supplementary materials. 2. Sound design, minimize distracting background.